She wasn't hiding anything, and yet, by sunrise, her house would be surrounded. The cold came in quiet that night, the kind that crept under doors and settled deep into old bones, turning every breath into something visible, something fragile. Outside, the wind dragged across the empty road like a whisper no one wanted to hear, carrying with it the scent of frozen earth and distant pine. Margaret Whitmore had lived in that small house for nearly 40 years, long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary silence and the kind that meant something was wrong. It was just past 10:30 p.m. when she first noticed them. Two shapes at the edge of her porch light, barely moving, barely alive. At first, she thought they were shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes. But then one of them shifted. Slow, weak, a tremble more than a step. She opened the door just an inch, the hinges creaking softly, and the cold rushed in like it had been waiting. "Oh, Lord," she whispered under her breath. They were dogs, German shepherds, both of them thin, their coats dull with frost, ribs faintly visible beneath matted fur. One stood slightly ahead, ears half raised despite the exhaustion, amber eyes locked onto her with a kind of focus that didn't belong to strays. The other lay lower, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths, too tired to even lift its head. Margaret hesitated, just for a second, long enough for the wind to push harder against the door, long enough for doubt to creep in the way it always does when kindness asks for something in return. Then she opened it wider. "You can't stay out there," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the wind. The standing dog didn't move immediately. It watched her, not with fear, not with desperation, but with something else, something measured, as if it were deciding whether she could be trusted. Only after a few seconds did it step forward, slow and careful, each paw placed with intention. The second dog followed, or rather, was guided, nudged gently by the first until it managed to cross the threshold. The moment they stepped inside, the house seemed to exhale. Margaret closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold, the dark, and whatever else had followed those animals to her porch. "All right now, easy," she murmured, already reaching for an old towel draped over the back of a chair. She moved slowly, mindful of every motion, as if afraid a sudden gesture might shatter whatever fragile trust had just been given to her. She knelt beside the weaker dog first, pressing the towel gently against its fur, soaking up the melted frost. The dog didn't flinch, didn't resist. It simply lay there, eyes half open, watching her with a quiet that felt almost human. The other one never took its eyes off her. Not for a second, even when she stood to fetch a bowl of water. Even when she lit the small fireplace in the corner, the soft crackle of wood filling the room with warmth. It stood near the door, body angled slightly, ears twitching at sounds Margaret couldn't hear. Guarding, waiting. "You don't have to be afraid," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was reassuring. The standing dog blinked once, slow and deliberate, then stepped closer, just enough to close the distance. Not enough to relax. Margaret set the bowl down. The weaker dog drank first, slow but steady, while the other only sniffed, then lifted its head again, attention drifting toward the windows, the walls, the silence outside. That was the moment something inside Margaret shifted. These weren't just lost dogs. She couldn't explain it. Not yet. But she could feel it. In the way they moved. In the way they watched. In the way one refused to rest while the other struggled just to breathe. Hours passed quietly. The fire burned low. The clock ticked past midnight. Margaret dozed in her chair, a blanket over her lap, the soft rhythm of two unfamiliar breaths filling the room. And still, one of them never truly slept. Near 3 a.m., it rose. Silent. Slow. It walked to the front door and stood there, ears forward, body still as stone. Listening. Waiting. As if it knew something was coming. And outside, far beyond the reach of Margaret's porch light, the night did not feel as empty as it should have. The house held its breath in that quiet hour before dawn, when the world feels suspended between what was and what is about to be, and Margaret stirred in her chair without fully waking, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket, as if some distant instinct had brushed against her sleep, while near the front door the standing dog remained fixed in place, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of its chest, its gaze locked on something beyond the walls, something that did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of wind and trees. And then it happened, not loud, not sudden, but just enough to exist, a faint crunch far out on the gravel road. The kind of sound most people would dismiss as settling earth or shifting frost. But the dog did not dismiss it. Its ears sharpened forward, its posture tightening by a fraction, and a low sound formed deep in its chest, not a growl meant to threaten, but one that carried warning, awareness, memory, and the second dog, still curled near the fireplace, stirred at that sound, lifting its head with effort, eyes searching for its companion, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, a silent exchange that needed no words, as if confirming something only they understood, while Margaret shifted again, her eyes fluttering open just slightly, not fully aware, only sensing that the room had changed, that the warmth of the fire now held an edge of tension she could not name, and she whispered softly, her voice thick with sleep. "It is all right. You are safe here." But the words hung in the air without settling, because safety, whatever it had been, no longer felt complete. The standing dog turned its head slightly toward her at the sound of her voice, just enough to acknowledge her presence, but then it returned its focus to the door, unwavering, as if the world outside demanded more of its attention than the comfort within. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time had a way of stretching in moments like this, and then another sound came, closer this time. The faint hum of an engine idling somewhere beyond the trees, low and steady, not rushing, not aggressive, just present, and the dog's body responded instantly, muscles tightening, weight shifting forward, ready but controlled, while the weaker dog pushed itself up onto unsteady legs, drawn by the same unseen signal, its movements slow but determined, and Margaret, now more awake, blinked into the dim light of the room, her gaze moving from the dogs to the window, where the faintest hint of blue was beginning to touch the edges of the sky, dawn approaching, and with it something else, something that made her chest tighten without reason. She rose slowly from her chair, careful not to startle them, and stepped toward the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch, enough to see the outline of the road beyond her yard. And at first there was nothing, just the pale stretch of gravel and the dark shapes of trees, but then she saw it. A vehicle parked further down, partially hidden, its lights off, its presence quiet but deliberate, and her breath caught in her throat, not out of fear exactly, but out of the sudden realization that this night had not been as simple as she had believed, that the two animals now inside her home had not arrived by accident. Behind her, the standing dog let out a soft exhale, almost like a confirmation, as if to say that what she now saw had already been known, already expected. Margaret lowered the curtain slowly, her mind searching for explanations, none of them settling, and she turned back toward the dogs, studying them in a way she had not before, noticing the subtle details she had overlooked, the posture too disciplined for strays, the awareness too constant, the bond between them too precise, and in that moment, something shifted inside her, not fear, not regret, but understanding beginning to form at the edges. "Who are you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer, and yet the standing dog stepped closer, just one pace, its amber eyes meeting hers fully now, steady, calm, carrying something deeper than instinct, something trained, something purposeful, and for the first time since they had crossed her threshold, it lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing that she had given them shelter when it mattered most. And outside, the faint hum of the engine remained, patient, waiting, as the first light of morning began to rise over the quiet house that no longer felt unnoticed. The first knock did not sound like a knock at all, just a firm, measured tap that carried through the wood of the front door with a quiet authority, the kind that does not ask to be heard but expects it. And Margaret felt it in her chest before she fully understood it, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as she turned toward the door, while the standing dog moved instantly, placing itself between her and the entrance, not aggressive, not threatening, but deliberate, as if it had rehearsed this moment long before it ever stepped onto her porch. And the weaker dog, though still unsteady, struggled to its feet again, drawn by the same invisible thread, its body trembling but its eyes alert now, fully awake, fully aware. And the second knock came, this time clearer, followed by a voice, calm, controlled, carrying through the door without strain. "Ma'am, this is the county sheriff's office." We need you to step outside, please. And Margaret froze for just a second, not out of fear, but because nothing in her quiet life had prepared her for that sentence being directed at her home. At her, in this moment, and she glanced down at the dogs, searching for something, anything that would make sense of what was happening. But all she found was stillness, the kind that waits, the kind that knows. And the standing dog turned its head slightly toward her again, those amber eyes meeting hers, with a steadiness that felt almost grounding, as if reminding her to stay calm, to move carefully. And Margaret took a slow breath, her hand rising instinctively to her chest before lowering again, and she stepped forward, each movement measured, her slippers soft against the wooden floor, the air inside the house suddenly feeling thinner, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. "All right, I am coming," she called out, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had begun to quicken, and she reached for the handle, pausing just before turning it, her eyes flicking once more toward the dogs. And in that brief moment something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. She had given them shelter, and now whatever followed would include her, whether she wanted it or not. She opened the door slowly, the early morning light spilling in, pale and cold, revealing the shapes that had been hidden in darkness before. 2 patrol cars parked at the edge of her yard, another vehicle further back, and 3 officers standing just beyond her porch, their posture alert but not hostile, their attention fixed on her, one of them stepping forward slightly. A man in his 40s with a composed expression and steady eyes. "Ma'am, are you Margaret Whitmore?" he asked, his tone respectful but firm, and she nodded, her hand still resting lightly on the doorframe. "Yes, that is me," she replied, her voice quieter now, and the officer gave a small nod, glancing briefly past her shoulder into the house, not intruding, just observing. And then he spoke again. "We have reason to believe there may be 2 animals inside your residence that we need to identify." And Margaret felt the words settle slowly, each one carrying more weight than the last. And for a moment she considered explaining, telling them everything about the night before, about the cold and the way the dogs had looked at her. But something held her back, something in the way the dogs had behaved, something in the way they now stood just behind her, silent and watchful. And she turned slightly, enough for the officers to see them clearly for the first time, the standing dog still positioned protectively, the other close beside it, both calm, both unmoving, and the reaction was immediate but controlled, a subtle shift in the officer's posture, a quick exchange of glances, recognition passing between them like a signal, and the man at the front exhaled slowly, almost as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Ma'am, those are not stray dogs," he said, his voice lowering just slightly, not in secrecy, but in gravity, and Margaret felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in the realization that whatever had arrived at her doorstep the night before had carried more than just cold and hunger. It had carried a story, one that was only now beginning to reveal itself, and behind her, the standing dog took one slow step forward, not crossing the threshold, not challenging, just present, its eyes now fixed on the officers, steady and unafraid, as if it, too, was waiting for what would come next. The air between the porch and the yard seemed to tighten as if the morning itself had decided to hold its breath, and Margaret remained where she stood, one hand still resting lightly on the doorframe, while the officers watched not just her, but the 2 figures behind her, their attention sharpening in a way that did not feel like suspicion, but recognition. And the man in front took a slow step forward, careful, measured, his boots stopping just short of the first wooden step. "Ma'am, I am going to ask you to remain calm," he said, his tone steady, not urgent, not threatening, but weighted with something deeper, something that carried both caution and respect. And Margaret gave a small nod, her eyes flicking briefly back toward the dogs as if to confirm they were still there, still real, still as quiet as they had been all night. "They showed up last night," she said softly, her voice finding its footing now. "They were freezing. I could not leave them out there." And for a moment no one spoke, the kind of silence that stretches just long enough to feel intentional, until one of the other officers, younger, standing slightly behind, leaned closer to the first and murmured something under his breath, too low for Margaret to hear, but enough to shift the atmosphere again. And the lead officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, "You did the right thing," he said, and there was no hesitation in it. No doubt. Just a simple acknowledgement that seemed to settle something inside Margaret's chest, though it did not answer the question that had been building since she first saw that vehicle on the road. "What is going on?" she asked, not demanding, not afraid, just needing to understand, and the officer's gaze moved once more toward the dogs, lingering there, studying the way they stood. The way one remained slightly forward while the other stayed close behind, their bodies aligned not by accident, but by instinct, by training. And then he spoke, more quietly now, as if the words themselves carried weight that needed to be handled with care. "Those dogs, they belong to a unit that has been looking for them all night." And Margaret felt something shift inside her again, not shock exactly, but confirmation, as if the pieces she had not known how to name were finally beginning to form a picture. "A unit?" she repeated, her voice softer now, and the officer nodded, glancing briefly back toward the vehicles before returning his attention to her. "Military K-9s," he said, "highly trained. They went missing during a transport late yesterday evening." And the words settled into the quiet space between them, and Margaret's eyes drifted once more to the dogs, seeing them now not just as two creatures in need, but as something more, something shaped by purpose, by discipline, by a world far beyond her small home. And behind her, the standing dog shifted slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting its stance as if acknowledging the conversation without breaking its focus. And the weaker dog remained close, its breathing steadier now, but its gaze no less aware. And the officer continued, his tone steady but carrying a trace of something almost like relief. "We have been tracking their last known location since early morning, and your property came up on the edge of that range." And Margaret let out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding, her fingers tightening slightly against the wood of the doorframe before relaxing again. "They did not seem lost," she said, almost to herself, and the officer gave a faint, understanding nod. "They rarely are," he replied. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that simple exchange, the acknowledgement that what had happened here was not random, not accidental, but something guided, something intentional. And then another sound approached, softer than the earlier engine, more controlled, a vehicle pulling closer, its tires moving slowly over the gravel, and every officer turned slightly at once, their attention shifting in unison, while behind Margaret, both dogs reacted instantly, their posture changing in a way that was unmistakable, alert, focused, but not tense, something else now present in their stance, something almost like anticipation, and Margaret felt it too. That subtle change in the air, the way the moment seemed to lean forward, waiting, as the new vehicle came to a stop just beyond the others, its door opening with a quiet click, and footsteps followed, steady, purposeful, approaching the house without hesitation. And though she had never heard them before, Margaret knew somehow, without explanation, that whoever was coming now was not a stranger to the two silent figures standing just behind her. The footsteps slowed as they reached the edge of the yard, steady and unhurried, each step carrying a weight that did not belong to uncertainty, but to purpose. And the officers instinctively shifted aside just enough to make space, not out of command, but out of recognition, while Margaret remained at the doorway, her breath quiet, her eyes fixed on the figure emerging from the pale morning light, a man in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple field jacket and worn boots, his presence calm but unmistakably grounded, as if he carried something heavier than the cold air around him. And the moment he stepped fully into view, something changed behind her. The standing dog inhaled sharply, its body tightening not in defense, but in awareness, and then, without a sound, it took one step forward, then another, crossing the threshold slowly, deliberately, while the weaker dog followed as best it could, its movements still unsteady but guided by something stronger. Then exhaustion, and Margaret felt it before she understood it, the shift in the room, the way the silence deepened rather than broke, and the man stopped a few feet from the porch, his eyes moving past the officers, past the open door, and landing on the two dogs as if the rest of the world had simply fallen away. And for a long second no one spoke, not the officers, not Margaret, not even the wind. And then the man exhaled, a quiet, almost imperceptible release, as if something he had been holding onto had finally loosened. "There you are," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a familiarity that did not need explanation, and the standing dog responded in kind, not with a bark, not with excitement, but with a subtle shift forward, closing the distance by just a few inches, its ears lowering slightly, its posture softening in a way Margaret had not seen before, and the weaker dog let out a faint sound, something between a breath and a quiet whine, its tail giving the smallest movement against the floor, and the man stepped closer, slow, careful, his hands visible, his movements deliberate, as if approaching something sacred rather than simply retrieving what had been lost. "Easy now," he murmured, not as a command, but as a reassurance, and when he finally reached them, he knelt down, one knee touching the cold ground, his eyes never leaving theirs, and for a moment, just a moment, everything stilled, the kind of stillness that does not come from absence, but from presence, from something real enough to quiet everything else. And then the standing dog moved, just slightly, lowering its head until it was level with his hand, allowing the contact, accepting it, and the man's fingers rested gently against the side of its neck, not gripping, not claiming, just there, a connection that spoke of time, of trust, of shared moments that Margaret could only guess at, and the weaker dog leaned closer as well, pressing its head lightly against his arm, seeking something it clearly recognized, and the man closed his eyes for a brief second, his hand moving between them, steady, grounding, and when he opened them again, there was something different there, not relief. Exactly, but something deeper, something earned, and he looked up toward Margaret then, really seeing her for the first time, and there was no suspicion in his gaze, no question, only understanding. "You took them in," he said quietly, and Margaret nodded, her voice soft. "They needed somewhere warm," she replied, and the man gave a small nod, as if that was enough, as if that single act explained everything that mattered, and he rose slowly to his feet, his hand lingering for just a second, longer on the dogs before stepping back, allowing them space, though they did not move away, staying close, as if unwilling to break the connection entirely, and one of the officers stepped forward slightly, speaking in a lower tone now. "Sergeant Brooks, we have secured the area," and the name settled into the air, Daniel Brooks, and Margaret felt it click into place, not just who he was, but what he represented, and Daniel nodded once, his attention still divided between the officers and the two silent companions beside him. "They were not lost," he said calmly, almost to himself, and Margaret understood then, without needing the rest explained, that whatever had brought those dogs to her door had not been chance, but choice, and that somehow, in the quiet of a freezing night, they had found exactly where they were meant to be. For a moment, no one moved, as if the quiet connection between the man and the two dogs had created a space that even authority did not want to disturb, and Margaret remained at the doorway, watching the way they stayed close to him, not clinging, not frantic, but anchored, like something that had finally found its center again, and Daniel Brooks stood still for a second longer before gently exhaling, his gaze shifting back toward the officers, his voice calm, controlled. "They stayed together," he said, almost as a statement of fact rather than relief, and one of the deputies nodded slightly. "We tracked signs of two." "Yes, moving in parallel for miles," and Daniel gave a faint nod, his eyes drifting down to the weaker dog, noting the slow but steady rise of its chest, the way it leaned subtly toward him. "She pushed herself farther than she should have," he murmured quietly, his hand lowering again to rest lightly along the dog's shoulder, not pressing, just present, and Margaret stepped out onto the porch then, drawn closer without realizing it, her slippers brushing softly against the wood. "She could barely stand when they came in," she said, her voice carrying a quiet concern, and Daniel looked up at her again, really listening, and gave a small nod. "She would not stop," he replied, and there was no drama in the words, just truth, and Margaret felt something settle deeper inside her chest, a recognition that these animals had not simply survived the cold, they had endured something more, something that had required choice, discipline, and purpose, and the lead officer shifted slightly, glancing between Daniel and the dogs. "Sergeant, we can arrange transport back to base immediately," he said, his tone respectful, but Daniel did not answer right away, his attention still resting on the two figures beside him, and then he shook his head once, slowly. "Not yet," he said, his voice low, steady, and the officer paused, not questioning, just waiting, and Daniel continued. "They made it here for a reason," and the words hung there. Simple, but carrying more meaning than explanation could offer, and Margaret felt her breath catch slightly at that, her eyes moving again between the man and the dogs, the way they seemed to exist in the same quiet understanding, and she spoke before she could stop herself. "They were watching the road," she said softly. "All night. One of them would not sleep." And Daniel's expression shifted just slightly, not surprise, but confirmation. "He would not," he said, glancing briefly at the standing dog. "He is trained to hold position until the objective is secure." And Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing that, feeling the weight of what that meant in the stillness of her small home. And one of the other officers stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We have a wider perimeter set, Sergeant, but if they let us here," he trailed off, and Daniel's eyes lifted, scanning the quiet road beyond the yard, the tree line, the distance where the vehicle had first appeared, and for a brief second, something sharper moved through his gaze, not fear, not urgency, but focus, the kind that comes from experience, from knowing that not every story ends where it begins. And then it passed, settling again into calm. "They did not lead you," he said quietly. "They chose where to stop." And Margaret felt those words more than she understood them, her fingers curling lightly against the railing of the porch. And the weaker dog shifted again, pressing closer to Daniel's side, while the other remained alert but no longer tense, its posture easing just enough to suggest that whatever it had been waiting for had arrived. And Daniel lowered his hand once more, brushing gently along the dog's neck, his voice softer now, almost to himself. "You held it together," he said, and Margaret realized then that he was not just speaking to them as animals, but as partners, as something more. And the morning light had fully risen now, casting a pale gold across the yard, the vehicles, the quiet house that had unknowingly become part of something larger, something that stretched beyond its walls. And for the first time since the knocking had begun, the air felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but still, grounded, as if whatever had needed to find its way here had finally arrived, and was now deciding what came next. The stillness did not break, it deepened, as if the moment itself had chosen to linger just a little longer, and Margaret found herself stepping 1 inch closer to the edge of the porch, her eyes moving between Daniel and the two dogs, noticing now the subtle details she had missed in the urgency of the night before, the faint marks along their collars, the way their posture shifted not randomly, but with intention, the quiet discipline that did not fade even in exhaustion. And Daniel stood there with them, not as a man reclaiming lost animals, but as someone rejoining something that had never truly left him, his hand resting lightly against the stronger dog's neck, his thumb brushing once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something deeper than presence. And then he spoke, not to the officers, not even fully to Margaret, but into the space between them. They were not just in transit, he said, his voice low, steady. They were carrying something, and the words settled into the air with a weight that shifted the meaning of everything that had happened. And the lead officer glanced briefly at one of the deputies, a silent exchange passing between them, before turning back. "We found the transport vehicle abandoned about 6 miles west of here," he said carefully. "No sign of struggle, no clear trail after that." And Daniel nodded once, his gaze lowering again to the dogs. "They do not abandon a route unless the route changes," he replied, and Margaret felt a faint chill pass through her, not from the cold, but from the quiet certainty in his voice. And she looked again at the road beyond her yard, the same road she had walked past 1,000 times without thought, now suddenly carrying a different meaning, as if it had been part of something she had never been meant to see. And the weaker dog shifted slightly, leaning more firmly into Daniel's leg, its breathing stronger now, but still measured, while the other lifted its head just a little higher, scanning the distance once more, though not with urgency anymore, more like confirmation, as if the task it had been holding onto had reached its end. And Daniel crouched again, his movements calm, unhurried, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It is all right," he said, his hand moving between them. You brought it this far. And Margaret felt her throat tighten slightly at that. The simplicity of it, the acknowledgement, and she realized then that whatever they had carried was not something visible, not something she could see or touch, but something that had required them to keep moving, to endure the cold, to choose a direction when none was given. And one of the deputies spoke up quietly. Sir, if they altered course, it might mean they were redirected. And Daniel's eyes lifted again, thoughtful now, but not unsettled. Or they followed the safest point available, he said. And he glanced briefly toward Margaret's home, the porch, the light, the door that had been opened when they needed it most. And Margaret understood without needing the words spelled out, her hand resting lightly against the railing as she absorbed the weight of that idea, that her small decision, one moment of hesitation followed by one act of kindness, had not just given shelter, but had become part of something larger, something precise. And the lead officer exhaled slowly, his posture easing slightly. Either way, Sergeant, we will need to debrief and confirm next steps, he said, and Daniel nodded once, standing again. But his attention did not fully leave the dogs, not yet, as if he was allowing them to settle, to come down from whatever silent mission had carried them through the night. And the stronger dog finally shifted its stance, stepping half a pace back, not retreating, but releasing its hold on that invisible line it had been guarding, while the weaker one lowered itself gently to the porch floor, its body finally allowing a small measure of rest. And Margaret watched them both, her eyes soft now, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something quieter, something steadier, and she spoke again, her voice low. They chose this place, she said, almost to herself, and Daniel looked at her, meeting her gaze fully this time, and there was no doubt in his expression, only calm recognition. Yes, he said, and in that single word, Margaret felt the answer to everything she had not known how to ask, that sometimes the smallest places become the right ones, not by chance, but by trust. And as the morning light settled across the yard, across the officers, across the quiet home that had stood unchanged for decades, it carried with it the sense that something unseen had passed through, something that had found its way exactly where it needed to go. And for the first time since the night had begun, the world felt whole again, not because everything was explained, but because everything had found its place. The morning no longer felt uncertain. It felt decided, as if the quiet choices made in the dark had already shaped everything that followed. And Margaret stood there on the porch, her hands resting lightly against the worn-wood railing, watching as the world she had always known slowly adjusted itself around something she had never expected to touch, while Daniel moved with a calm that did not rush the moment, his presence steady, his attention still anchored to the two dogs as they settled into a silence that no longer carried tension, only completion. And one of the officers stepped forward again, this time with less urgency, his tone measured. Sergeant, command is requesting confirmation on recovery status, he said, holding a radio loosely at his side. And Daniel glanced briefly toward him, then back to the dogs, as if weighing something that could not be rushed by protocol alone, and he gave a small nod. Confirmed, he replied, his voice quiet but certain, both accounted for. And the officer relayed the message without question, his words carrying outward into a system far larger than this quiet yard. And yet the moment itself remained small, contained, grounded in the simple space between a man, two animals, and a woman who had opened her door without knowing what would follow. And Margaret shifted slightly, her gaze softening as she looked at the weaker dog now resting more fully on the porch, its breathing even, its body no longer fighting against the cold that had once threatened it. And she spoke again, almost gently. She should be seen by someone, she said, her voice carrying that quiet concern that does not ask for permission. And Daniel nodded without hesitation. She will be, he said, and there was no doubt in it, only assurance. And then he paused, looking at her more directly. Because of you, he added, and Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, not out of discomfort, but out of the simple humility that comes when something small is seen for what it truly was. And she gave a faint shake of her head. Anyone would have done the same, she said softly, though even as she spoke it, she knew that was not always true, and Daniel seemed to understand that as well. But he did not argue. He only let the silence hold the truth for them both. and the stronger dog shifted then, stepping slightly closer to Margaret, just enough to close the distance between them, its head lowering again in that same quiet acknowledgement it had offered before, and Margaret hesitated only a second before lifting her hand, her fingers brushing lightly against the fur at its neck, feeling the warmth there, the life, the steadiness, and for a brief moment, everything else faded, the officers, the vehicles, the quiet tension of the morning, leaving only that simple contact, that shared presence, and then the dog stepped back, not withdrawing, but releasing the moment as naturally as it had come, and Daniel watched it happen, his expression unchanged but his eyes carrying a quiet understanding, and one of. The deputies approached carefully, holding a folded blanket, offering it without words, and Daniel accepted it with a nod, kneeling once more beside the weaker dog, draping it gently across its back, his movements precise, practiced, but still gentle in a way that spoke of more than routine, and the dog did not resist. It simply settled, its eyes half closing as if, for the first time since the night had begun, it allowed itself to rest without watching, without listening, without holding anything together, and the stronger dog remained nearby, its posture relaxed now, its ears no longer fixed on the distance, but resting in that quiet state that only comes when the work is done, and Margaret stepped back slightly, giving them space, though her eyes did not leave them, and she felt something unfamiliar settle inside her, not pride, not relief, but a quiet sense of having been part of something that mattered, something that would not be spoken about in detail, not explained fully, but understood in the way small, important things often are, and Daniel stood again after a moment, his hand resting briefly on the dog's side, and he looked once more at Margaret, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that did not need many words. "They will remember this place," he said quietly, and Margaret felt a faint smile touch her lips, not wide, not bright, but real, and she nodded once, her voice soft. "That is all right," she replied, and in that exchange, something settled, something complete, and as the officers began to move with quiet efficiency around them, preparing for what came next, the house stood unchanged, the porch worn as it had always been, the road still stretching out into the distance, but the morning carried something new within it, something that had passed through unnoticed by most, but not by those who had stood still long enough to feel it, and in the quiet space between departure and memory, everything that needed to be said had already been understood. The movement began quietly, not with urgency, but with purpose, as if every step taken now carried the understanding that nothing more needed to be proven, only completed, and Margaret stood just inside the doorway once again, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she watched the small gathering begin to shift, the officers speaking in low tones, the vehicles idling softly beyond the yard, and Daniel moving with the same steady calm that had marked every moment since his arrival, guiding rather than commanding, allowing the two dogs to move at their own pace, and the stronger one stepped forward first, not hesitating, not looking back immediately, but moving with that same quiet discipline that had brought it here, while the weaker dog rose more slowly, its body still carrying the memory of the cold night, but supported now by something stronger than before, something that no longer required effort to maintain, and Daniel remained close, not pulling, not directing, just present, his hand near enough to steady if needed, and for a moment, just before they reached the edge of the porch, the stronger dog paused, its body still, its head turning slightly, and its eyes found Margaret again, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, and in that brief glance, something passed between them, something that did not belong to words or explanations, and Margaret felt her chest tighten just slightly, not with sadness, but with the weight of something meaningful coming to its natural end, and she gave the smallest nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are going to be all right now," she said, and the dog held her gaze for 1 second longer before turning back, continuing forward without hesitation, and the weaker one followed, slower, but steady, its steps no longer uncertain, and Daniel guided them gently down the steps, the gravel crunching softly beneath their weight as they moved toward the waiting vehicles, and the officers stepped back just enough to give them space, their posture no longer alert, but respectful, as if recognizing that what had happened here was not simply a recovery, but something more, something that required a different kind of stillness. And as they reached the first vehicle, one of the deputies opened the rear door carefully, not rushing the moment, and Daniel paused, crouching once more beside the weaker dog, his hand resting along its side, his voice low and steady. "Easy now," he murmured, and the dog stepped forward, guided by trust rather than command, settling inside without resistance, while the stronger one remained just outside for a moment, standing beside Daniel, its posture calm, its gaze steady, and then, without prompting, it stepped forward as well, entering the vehicle with the same quiet certainty it had carried through the night, and Daniel closed the door gently, his hand lingering on the metal for a brief second, as if marking the end of something unseen, and when he turned back toward the house, his eyes met Margaret's once more, and there was no need for explanation, no need for long words, only a quiet understanding that what had passed between them had been enough, and he gave a small nod, the kind that carries gratitude without asking for recognition, and Margaret returned it, her expression soft, her posture still, as if she were holding on to the moment just long enough to let it settle fully. And then the vehicles began to move, slowly at first, the gravel shifting beneath the tires, the sound gentle against the morning air, and Margaret remained where she was, watching as they made their way down the road, past the edge of her yard, past the place where the night had first changed, until they disappeared beyond the trees, leaving only the quiet behind. And for a long moment she did not move, the world around her returning to its familiar rhythm, the wind softer now, the light warmer, the house unchanged, and yet something within it felt different, as if a small part of something larger had passed through and left its mark, not in any visible way, but in the stillness that followed, and she finally stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind her, the sound soft, final, and she paused there for just a second, her hand resting against the wood, her eyes drifting toward the place near the fireplace where the two dogs had lain only hours before, and she let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not relieved, just steady, as if acknowledging something she did not need to fully understand. And the house settled once more into silence, the kind that no longer carried uncertainty, but something quieter, something complete, and outside, the road stretched on as it always had. But for those who had been there, who had seen what passed through in the dark, it would never feel entirely ordinary again, because sometimes, without warning, the smallest door becomes the place where something important finds its way home.